Police misconduct and corruption against black people is not new. But when it's done against black people, by black people, it's especially troubling. And that's what Ronald Watts did. He's a disgraced former Chicago cop that ran a criminal drug enterprise and terrorized black people who came from the same community that he did. In many ways, he's like the Alonzo Harris character that Denzel Washington played in the movie Training Day. He thought he was untouchable because his victims were black, and he figured that no one cared or even dared to try to stop him, until the FBI did. Ronald Watts grew up in public housing. This is interesting because he preyed on the same black people in public housing that he grew up with. He joined the Army in 1983 and worked as a military police officer. He left the Army and eventually joined the Chicago Police Department in 1994. He patrolled what is known as the South Side. This was the part of the city where most black people escaped to after fleeing the South and migrating to the North during the Second Great Migration. They escaped segregation and racial terror, only to find a new and more insidious form in the North. By the time Watts arrived to patrol the streets, long gone were the days of black commerce, and what was left were public housing, neglect, and vacant lots. He patrolled the IDB Wells housing project, a vast housing row complex built in 1941 to house black people and to keep them out of white neighborhoods. It was named after IDB Wells, a black female journalist and anti-lynching crusader. But there was a problem in the projects. After decades of neglect, they were controlled by gangs. The police and the housing authority had long given up and had abandoned black people who lived there and allowed crime and violence to descend. Thousands of black people were left and held hostage to criminality while the police watched and did nothing. This was a perfect storm for Watts because not only did he watch, he decided to join in and take it over for himself. Chicago's public housing had gotten so violent and so dangerous that the federal government actually took it over in 1994. But the city managed to regain control in 1999. And one of the first things that the city did was to create a new public housing policing unit. Ronald Watts, now a sergeant, joined the unit as a supervisor. The first thing that he did was to bring on a team of officers that he worked with before in another district. One of them would later be his co-defendant, Khalid Muhammad. The IDB Wells, like so many of the housing projects in the city, had become dysfunctional, filled with poor black people who were stacked on top of one another, surrounded by neglect and violence and drugs and social disorder. All of this spelled an opportunity for Watts because together, Watts and his crew would frame, abuse, terrorized hundreds of black residents of the IDB Wells housing project. What Watts and his crew unleashed on black residents will rival the greatest criminal enterprises seen in the last 50 years. They used their power as police officers to frame and arrest drug dealers and residents who refused to pay them off in drugs and in cash. Black residents will often complain to the police and city leaders about why they couldn't just stop and shut down the illegal drug trade that was happening in the projects. One of the reasons it was allowed to keep going was because police officers like Watts were running it and making a lot of money doing it. So this is how Watts and his crew would operate. They would arrest people and find drugs and cash that would mysteriously not make it into the evidence inventory. Watts would also hang out around dice games and shake down people as they left with their winnings. But as you can imagine, that didn't bring in enough cash, so Watts and his team upped their game and expanded their criminal enterprise. They began to control the drug market themselves. They would extort drug dealers in the projects. They called it the Watts tax. Drug dealers had to pay the tax to Watts for protection from police interference. And in exchange for the tax payment, Watts and his crew would target competing drug dealers and operations and redirect those drugs to his own drug lines. And if you didn't pay, he'd plant drugs on you and arrest you and send you to prison. Watts and his crew were bringing in as much as $50,000 a week. It would be bad enough if that was all that Watts was involved in, but there are rumors that he did more. Back in 2006, rumors were spreading that Watts had been involved in the hit of a drug dealer named Wilbert Moore, also known as Big Shorty. He was a drug dealer that operated out of the IDB Wells housing projects when he began working with the DEA. He was going to provide evidence against Watts when he was gunned down by two men outside of a barbershop. After the movie Training Day came out, residents started calling Watts Alonzo. Remember that scene where Alonzo tells the residents that he's going to put cases on everybody? Well, according to one resident out of the IDB Wells housing projects, Watts said that exact line to them after someone filed a complaint against him with the police department. Instead of actually investigating it, the police told Watts what happened, and he came to the IDB Wells and started screaming that he was going to put cases on anyone who filed a complaint against him, just like Alonzo said in the movie Training Day. What Watts was doing was not just known to those who he victimized. The police department knew what he was doing as well and chose not to do anything about it. As far back as the early 2000s, there were investigations into Watts and his crew, and yet he was allowed to do everything he wanted to do, and no one stopped him. Clarissa Glenn and Ben Baker were only two of the hundreds of victims Ronald Watts abused and framed. But what happened to them reads like it came out of a Hollywood movie. Clarissa and Ben lived together in the IDB Wells projects where Ronald Watts patrolled and extorted money from drug dealers and framed black residents who lived there. Watts had been extorting Ben, who lived there for years. Ben, who was in his early 30s, lived with Clarissa and their two sons. Ben wasn't perfect. He had run-ins with the law before, but he didn't deserve what Watts did to him and his family. Ronald Watts framed Ben twice on false drug charges and even framed Clarissa by planting drugs on both of them. Here's what happened. The first time Watts planted drugs on Ben happened in March of 2005. At the time, Ben was just 3 weeks away from completing a 2-year probation sentence for a prior drug case. The new arrest meant that Ben could spend up to 60 years in prison. Ben said that Watts had framed him. With the help of a lawyer, Ben and Clarissa were able to speak with the prosecutor in the public correction unit at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. To their surprise, the prosecutor said that he was well aware of Watts and how he'd been framing people and shaking down drug dealers, and Watts was being investigated. Ben and Clarissa thought that this would help Ben's case. They figured, how could the state prosecute Ben when they were already investigating Watts for corruption? Ben and Clarissa were wrong. Nothing came of the investigation, and the state went forward with Ben's prosecution. Watts continued to harass Ben and Clarissa. He would come to their home and search it without a warrant. Clarissa tried to complain again. This time, she filed a complaint with the Office of Professional Standards, the agency that was tasked with investigating police misconduct in Chicago. Instead of actually investigating Watts, the agency told Watts about the complaint. A couple of months after Clarissa complained, she and Ben were pulled over by Watts and other police officers. Watts pretended like he conducted a search of the car and then pulled drugs out of his sleeve and said that he found them in the vehicle. Both Clarissa and Ben were arrested. Clarissa had never been arrested before, and Ben was still fighting the first drug case that Watts had framed him for. Despite knowing that Watts was dirty, the state went to trial on Ben's first case. Watts and 3 officers testified that they saw Ben with drugs. Ben's attorney went after Watts and accused him of being a corrupt cop, but the judge didn't believe him. The judge said that he knew that Watts had been investigated before, but it didn't matter because nothing came of those investigations. It was a bench trial, and the judge found Ben guilty. He sentenced Ben to 18 years in prison. 3 months later, Ben was brought back to the same courtroom to stand trial on the second drug case that Watts had put on him and Clarissa. The prosecutors offered Ben and Clarissa a deal. If they pleaded guilty, Ben would get an additional 4 years and Clarissa would get only 1 year probation instead of the 4 years in prison that she could have received. Facing the possibility of their children being without both of their parents, Ben and Clarissa pleaded guilty. In 2007, the FBI began investigating Watts and his crew. A federal prosecutor named Thomas Shankshaft, who would later go on to bring down El Chapo, began looking into Watts. Over the next several years, a team of prosecutors, informants, and police officers like Shannon Spalding all worked to bring Watts down. Here's how they eventually got him. Clarissa helped the FBI. She would recruit informants who were going to work with the FBI to gather evidence against Watts. The FBI conducted a sting operation. They created a ruse by having an informant that they had turned tell Watts that he worked for other drug dealers and transported backpacks of drugs and cash for them. Watts and his partner in crime, Khalid Mohammed, took the money from the undercover informant that they thought came from other drug dealers. It was actually money given to them by the informant from the FBI. Watts and his partner were arrested as a result of this. Now, Watts initially pleaded not guilty, but on the eve of his trial, he changed his plea to guilty. Now, the maximum sentence that Watts could have received was 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Watts was sentenced to 22 months in prison and forced to pay a fine of $5,200. After receiving his sentence, Watts smiled as he left the courtroom. He'd won again. 20 years of terrorizing his fellow black citizens, and he'd gotten off with a slap on the wrist. For all that he'd done, that's all that he got, less than 2 years in prison. Aside from the $5,200 he had to pay back what he took from the informant, he was allowed to keep all of his assets, including all the money he made by robbing drug dealers. Watts eventually served his time and now lives in another state. Despite the fact that Watts had been convicted, Ben remained in prison. By the time that Watts had been convicted, Ben had already done more than 7 years in prison. It took an additional 3 years for Ben to finally be released from prison in 2015. In all, Ben had done 10 years in prison for drug charges put on him by Watts. Even though Ben and Clarissa were able to get their convictions vacated, what they lost can never be replaced. Ben and Clarissa are only 2 of the more than 200 people that have had their convictions thrown out because of Watts. So far, over 200 convictions tied to Watts have been vacated. However, so many more remain behind bars for what they did. In all, Watts was involved in over 500 arrests between 2004 and 2012. Yet, prosecutors have yet to overturn all of those convictions. It is beyond dispute what Watts did to black residents of the I.W. Wells housing project. Yet, the city of Chicago continues to defend him, and they say that he did nothing wrong. Over 70 civil rights lawsuits have been filed by Watts victims against the city and against Watts. The city of Chicago has hired private lawyers to defend Watts in each of those lawsuits. Chicago is paying millions of dollars to attorneys to deny Watts victims justice again.